You know that feeling you get when you know that you have to perform at your absolute best? That feeling of resolve, determination, but also maybe some nervousness about not screwing up. Well, certain conditions can make pilots feel exactly that same way, and when you add on unreliable weather reports and an aircraft design feature working opposite to how it should, unpleasant things can start to happen. Stay tuned. On the 5th of March of 2015, the northeastern part of the United States was in the grip of a major winter storm. It had brought with it significant amounts of snowfall over the New York area and was forecasted to continue to do so for a big part of the day. But the poor weather did not stop the continuous stream of aircraft that were arriving and departing from the giant city's main airports. And to keep that operation running, the runway clearing teams at JFK and LaGuardia had been put on high alert already the day before and were now working hard with their plows and sweeping machines to keep the runways as safe as possible. Far south of New York, in Daytona Beach, Florida, the weather was significantly more pleasant as a crew from Delta Airlines reported for duty in the early hours of the morning. They were about to start the second day of a 4-day trip together, and on the previous day they had operated 3 flights before they reached Daytona Beach for their night stop. The pilots had then later enjoyed a dinner together at their hotel before going to bed at around 2100 to prepare for the early morning departure that they had scheduled on the following day. Both of them were feeling well rested and ready to fly again as they met up with their 3 cabin crew colleagues at around 0500 in the morning on the 5th of March to start their pre-flight preparation. They were scheduled for another 3 flights on that day, starting with a leg from Daytona Beach to Atlanta, then onwards to LaGuardia Airport in New York, and then finally to Orlando, where they would have their next night stop. When they started reviewing their briefing documents, they could see that the weather in New York was potentially going to be a problem, but that is often the case during the winter months and normally not a major concern. Because when we pilots are faced with poor weather at any of our destinations, we will always first verify that it's good enough for planning purposes, which is a set of visibility, wind and runway condition requirements that has to be within limits before departure. If it is, we will then make sure that our alternates are holding up as well, and after that start planning on how much extra fuel we will take to anticipate potential holdings for snow clearing or delays. If the weather is not good enough, well, then we can still actually take off towards our destination, but we will need to have at least 2 alternates with good enough weather instead. We need that, so if we reach our destination and the weather is still not good enough to land, we can just divert to one of those alternates. Because we always operate this way, we will never really take any chances. We will always be able to land somewhere with enough fuel, so when these 2 pilots were looking at the weather in New York for later on, it wouldn't have bothered them too much. The good news was that the weather in Atlanta and Orlando was looking fine, and there were no other NOTAMs or technical issues that was holding them back. So they decided on the fuel for the first leg, called that into the fueler, and then proceeded to brief the cabin crew who was waiting to get out to the aircraft. During the briefing, the captain told the crew that the weather in New York was very snowy and warned them that this could lead to possible holdings or diversions, but that nothing else was out of the ordinary. On the way out to the aircraft, the pilots decided that the captain was going to be pilot flying for the first leg, so he started setting up the cockpit whilst the first officer completed the walk around. Now, these 2 pilots were both very experienced, with the captain having flown 15,200 hours in total, of which 11,000 of those had been flown on the aircraft they were now going to operate, the McDonnell Douglas MD-88. He was 56 years old, and at the time of the flight he had over 9,700 hours of command experience. Before joining the airline, he had been flying the F-16 in the US Air Force, where he had also served as a T-38 instructor. The first officer was 46 years old and had about 11,000 hours of total flight time, with 3,000 of those flown on the MD-88. He had previously flown on the Boeing 737, the Boeing 727 as a flight engineer, and also as a pilot on the E-2C Hawkeye for the US Navy. The 2 pilots were getting along really well, and the pre-flight went off without a hitch, so at time 0557, a few minutes before schedule even, the aircraft started pushing back for its first flight up towards Atlanta. This flight was completely uneventful, but the pilots knew that the real challenge of the day would likely be coming up on the second leg, so they spent some time in the cruise looking through the forecasted weather again and doing some planning for that coming flight. Now, before we go any further, let's take some time here and talk about the aircraft that these two pilots were operating. The MD-88 belongs to the second generation of the popular DC-9 family. It's a stretched version with two large JT8 Delta 219 turbofan engines mounted on the aft part of the fuselage, and because of that, it's also equipped with a T-tail. The fact that the engines were placed in the back of the aircraft and much closer to each other than, for example, on a Boeing 737, meant that the effect of asymmetric thrust after a potential engine failure was much less severe due to a smaller moment arm. This in turn meant that the rudder could be made smaller, and the fact that this smaller rudder was situated so relatively close to the engines will have a very big impact on what's about to happen. And why is that then? Well, when an aircraft of this size is maneuvering on the ground at low speeds, it generally uses nose wheel steering to do that. This is accomplished by the use of a separate tiller in the cockpit, but the nose wheel steering can also be accomplished to a smaller degree from the rudder pedal, so normally moves the rudder. This is important because during the takeoff roll, the pilots will be able to make small adjustments to the direction with the nose wheel steering until there is enough air flowing over the rudder so that it can be used for directional control. This happens when the rudder becomes aerodynamically effective, above approximately 80 knots or 150 kilometers per hour. Now, understanding this, the fact that the rudder needs a lot of undisturbed air flowing past it in order to be properly effective is super important, and I will tell you why after this. A while back, I started noticing that I was getting more and more strange emails from companies I had never visited and even newsletters I had never signed up for. It was just like someone else was signing me up for these things, or at least sharing my very personal data. And it turns out that that was absolutely what was happening, which I found out when I signed up to today's sponsor, Incogni. When the service was switched on, Incogni immediately found 51 different data brokers who were selling my personal information, including email, home address, financial information, and even data on my friends and relatives. This is actually their whole business idea, and it's perfectly legal unless you specifically tell them to stop. Unfortunately, you then have to first find all of them and then tell them this directly, which is hugely frustrating, but not if you use Incogni. Incogni will contact all of these data brokers on your behalf and then tell them to remove you from their records, and then they will continue to monitor their compliance for as long as you stay with them. I have already seen a significant reduction in spam, and if you want to try this out for yourself, then click on the link here below, which is incogni.com/pilot. Right now, they're running a special promotion, which will give you an incredible 60% discount when you sign up for the annual plan. Thank you, Incogni. Now back to the video. So, we have already talked about the fact that the engines are mounted on the back of the MD-80 rather than under the wings, and this comes with some advantages. Mainly that the whole aircraft could be made lower, making it easier for ground handlers to work on it and enabling a smaller and less heavy landing gear. It also made it quite a bit quieter inside the cabin and gave it a much lower risk for foreign object damage, FOD, since the engines were mounted further away from the ground. But it also came with some negatives, like the need to reinforce the back of the aircraft, which came with some weight penalties, and it also made it more complicated for engineers to work on the engines. On top of that, the T-tail made the aircraft more susceptible to something known as superstall, which is a very nasty aerodynamic situation that can happen if the aircraft stalls with a very high angle of attack, causing backwash from the wings to cancel out the effect of the elevators on the tail. Now, none of those things will play a role in this story, but something that will was another characteristics of its rear-mounted engines. You see, larger aircraft uses several ways to slow themselves down after landing or in case of rejected takeoff. They obviously have wheel brakes, which works very similar to the brakes of your car, equipped with anti-skid systems that senses wheel skids and reduces commanded brake pressure to always try and give optimum braking. Then there are the spoilers on the wings, which reduces or spoils the lift, forcing the weight onto the brakes and also adds aerodynamic drag. And then finally, we have the thrust reversers, which are constructed to redirect the thrust vector of the engines forward to achieve deceleration that way. On the MD-88, the reversers consist of two bucket doors which are mounted on the back of the engine fairings. On the ground, when the pilot moves the thrust levers back into the idle position, that will unlock the two reverser handles, which can then be moved backwards up to 120 degrees. When that happens, the two bucket doors close behind the engines, redirecting the entire airflow into slightly forward angles. Now, these reversers are very effective and they work best at high speed, but even at a standstill, they're so powerful that they can actually be used to reverse the aircraft under its own power, something that looks really weird. But those of you with a keen eye might have already seen a small problem with this system. If you redirect massive amounts of air forward from the engines at the position they are mounted, that will pretty quickly start disturbing the air that is supposed to be flowing over the rudder. And at higher thrust reverse settings, this becomes such a large disturbance that it can render the rudder almost completely ineffective, an effect known as rudder blanking. This was quickly noticed during early flight testing, and already back in the 1980s, McDonnell Douglas issued flight test reports saying that this might happen and that it could cause issues with rudder directional authority. It was shown that below 108 knots, these effects were noticeable with a reverse thrust setting as low as 1.3 engine pressure ratio, or EPR, and below 146 knots if the reversers were increased to over 1.6 EPR. Because of this, the Delta Flight Crew Training Manual issued guidance to its pilots to aim for 1.3 EPR reverse thrust on slippery or contaminated runways, and never to exceed 1.6 EPR. Now, the problem here, of course, is that it's precisely on slippery and contaminated runways that pilots really need reverse thrust, since the brakes will be significantly less effective then. And monitoring the exact EPR values during those kind of conditions can also be really challenging. To deal with this, McDonnell Douglas had in 1996 sent out a service bulletin advising it to install a new type of reverser cam that would include a detent, which, when it was used, would reverse in an EPR around 1.3 to help the pilots out. But only a year later, they told everyone to remove this detent, since several operators had found that the different engine riggings could make it difficult to accurately reproduce the expected EPR at the detent. So now the pilots were again left up to their own devices to make sure that they looked after this, and all airlines operating the MD-80 had approved training programs explaining this issue and allowing the pilots to practice it, so it was well known by the crews. This brings us back to the Delta crew, which was now getting closer to Atlanta. The first flight was completed without any problems, and after the aircraft had landed and taxied into the gate, the crew received an updated briefing pack as their passengers were disembarking. They could now see that the weather had not improved. In fact, it looked like it was getting a bit worse, with moderate snow now forecasted all the way up until midday. The latest weather report that the captain received indicated a wind of 330 degrees at 12 knots, visibility of half a mile in moderate snow and mist, and with a cloud cover at 700 feet. He was also given a NOTAM issued at 04:45 in the morning about the runway condition, which stated that runways at LaGuardia were wet and that they had been sanded and treated with solid chemicals. But what he didn't know was that another NOTAM had been issued at 07:38, saying that the runways were now snow-covered with a thin layer of wet snow instead. Now, these type of NOTAMs, which in Europe are known as SNOTAMs, are supposed to be issued regularly for airports where winter conditions might have an impact. The idea is that they should be updated as soon as the runway condition changes, and even if there's no change, the time of the release should still be updated, so the pilots and airlines know that they're dealing with the latest information. This was something that it later would be found out that LaGuardia Airport was not doing correctly. Now, by their very nature, these reports have to be taken with a grain of salt, since they're only really valid at the time the report is written and might change within minutes if it's still snowing continuously. Therefore, pilots generally use them to calculate dispatch landing performance, and we all know that further updates will be needed before landing. In any case, as the crew were now getting ready for their departure towards LaGuardia, they could see that the weather was still good enough to dispatch and that the weather at their alternates were also holding up. They calculated their dispatch landing performance, which included a 15% safety margin for a wet runway, and saw that they should be able to stop at 5,995 feet, which was about 1,000 feet shorter than the available runway length of 7,003 feet. It was the first officer's turn to be pilot flying on this leg, but the captain decided that he would fly this flight as well due to the poor expected landing conditions. This shows that the crew was well aware of the threats here and that the captain had already mentally started to prepare for them. He had actually been based at LaGuardia a few years before and therefore had a lot of experience of flying in there even in winter ops. In any case, they decided to carry a bit of extra fuel so that they would be able to hold for some time if they needed it. The minimum fuel, according to the flight plan, was 26,000 pounds, but they decided to upload 3,600 pounds extra just to be on the safe side. Now, in previous videos that I've made about fuel emergencies, I've been asked why pilots don't just fill the aircraft up like we do with cars, and there are actually several good reasons for that. First of all, aircraft are very weight sensitive and in most cases wouldn't even be able to take off if all the tanks were filled up to the brim with normal passenger loads. I have actually only filled up the 737 completely once in my career, and that's when I delivered a new empty aircraft from Seattle to Dublin. But also, it costs fuel to carry fuel, around 2.5% per ton per hour, so it's extremely uneconomical to be carrying around loads of extra fuel for no particular reason. But in this case, there's also another factor that the pilots needed to keep in mind. You see, with extra fuel, the aircraft would indeed be able to hold for longer, but if that hold wouldn't materialize, well, then they would also be carrying more weight during the landing, which would make their required landing distance even longer. So it's quite tricky to make these kind of decisions when you're dealing with winter ops, as the conditions always tend to keep changing. Anyway, as the pilots were having these discussions and preparing the aircraft for departure, the cabin crew were boarding the 127 passengers who were booked on the flight. Among those passengers were 2 lap-held infants who, because they didn't have their own seats, didn't have their own boarding cards either, something that will become important later on. When everything was completed, the pilots called up air traffic control, asked for clearance and started pushing back from the gate just a few minutes behind schedule. They taxied out normally, and at time 09:24, Delta Airlines flight 1086 took off from runway 28 in Atlanta and started tracking northeast towards New York. The aircraft climbed to its planned cruising altitude of 33,000 feet, and once all of the paperwork had been completed, the 2 pilots started turning their attention to the upcoming landing. About 1 hour and 10 minutes before the landing, the cockpit voice recorder picked up the first discussions regarding the complications that the weather would potentially bring them. The first officer had started looking up the crosswind limitations and found that if the braking action on the runway was found to be medium to poor, the maximum crosswind allowed would be 10 knots, a value that they were already at with their latest weather report. Now, braking action is the word that we use to describe how slippery the runway is, and it's divided into 6 different levels. Poor, medium to poor, medium, medium to good, good and dry. For each of these levels, there are performance tables in our manuals, which gives us the landing distance required based on wind, speed, weight and a few other factors. And when the pilots started looking into those tables, they quickly found that with the weight they were planning to arrive with, the runway would have to have a braking action of good or better in order for them to be able to land. If it turned out to be more slippery than that, well, then they wouldn't have enough margins to land and would have to divert to one of their alternates. Now, an interesting fact here is that the way that the braking action is calculated has changed over the last few decades. It used to be measured using a special vehicle or wagon that was driven over the runway surface with a measuring wheel lowered down onto it, which could brake and then spit out a numeric value of how slippery it was. This would then be transmitted to the air traffic control and then to arriving and departing aircraft. But the problem was that this tool had been found to be unreliable and not give data that would accurately describe how an aircraft brakes would actually perform. Because of that, this type of values had stopped being sent out to the pilots and was at this time only really used by the teams that were clearing the runway. So instead of these wagons, the FAA had suggested that some kind of device should be introduced that could accurately measure a landing aircraft's actual braking efficiency. But even though several such devices were in development, none had been officially approved. So this meant that what the pilots were actually left with was in many cases just a description of the runway conditions. Ice, wet snow or so on. And From that, they would then have to assess the braking action or rely on pilot reports from other landing aircraft, which could be very subjective. Now, since it was obvious that the braking action on the runway was going to be critical for whether they would be able to land or not, the crew sent out 2 different requests for updates via their ACAR system. One request went to their dispatcher in LaGuardia, where they also informed him that they wouldn't be able to land if the braking action was below good. And the other one went to the ARTCC controller, but neither of them had any updates to give them. In the meantime, the snow had started to accumulate on the runways in LaGuardia, and at time 10:06, the runways were temporarily closed to allow for snow clearing equipment to come in and start clearing them up. The clearing team quickly realized that it was no point in continuing to sand and treat the runways with chemicals, since they would have to periodically brush it, and this would just remove any chemicals added. This meant that the runway state now quickly changed from the wet, treated state that had been reported earlier to covered with wet snow, less than 1/4 of an inch. As the aircraft was proceeding along the route, the captain made a quick PA to the passengers, and when he was done, he needed to get to a quick bathroom break. So he left the cockpit and was replaced by one of the cabin attendants, who started chatting a bit with the first officer. Now, whilst the captain was away, the air traffic controller called the flight up and told them that they were clear to descend when ready to cross an RNAV point called Ridgey at flight level 270. The first officer read this back, set it up on the mode control panel, and then continued to chat with the flight attendant. But only 2 minutes later, the controller came back and told him to reduce the speed to a maximum of 250 knots over Ridgey, since there was now a chance that they would need to take up a hold later on. This was the first time that anyone had mentioned the possibility of a hold to the crew, and the reason for the hold was explained as the runway now being closed at LaGuardia for snow clearing. When the captain came back, the first officer briefed him about the descent clearance and the possibility that they might hold, and this annoyed the captain quite a bit, since the dispatcher had not mentioned anything about the runway being closed in his ACAR's message. They started their descent as planned when they reached the top of the descent point, and it's likely that this news about the sudden runway closure just further strengthened the captain's apprehension about the landing ahead of him. And it was not getting any better. The air traffic controller soon came back and cleared the aircraft to enter a holding over a VOR called Robbinsville and to await further instructions there. They proceeded towards the hold according to their flight plan, and the controller soon came back and asked the crew if they could accept an ILS approach into runway 13. The crew responded that this depended on the runway condition and the weather, but the controller just repeated his question, which confused the crew quite a bit. They said that they could certainly fly the approach, but the landing would depend on the braking action, which they had not been able to get from any source so far. The controller then said that he would come back with information when he received it, and then cleared them to descend down to flight level 200. Ahead of them in the hold, they now had several aircraft who were already running low on fuel. This prompted the crew to start reviewing their own fuel situation and decide on the minimum fuel that they could accept before diverting, all handled like the professionals and experienced pilots they were. The first officer listened in on the 80s and received information Quebec, which was recorded at 10:51. This information reported the runway to be covered with 1/4 of an inch of wet snow, but that all surfaces were wet and treated with sand and de-iced with solid chemicals. Now, according to the Delta Winthrop's manual, a wet runway did per definition provide good braking action, and based on that, the crew expected to see a black top runway with only patches of snow and ice on it. But as we discussed before, the clearing team had actually already stopped treating the runway with chemicals at this point, but this had not been updated on the 80s. The surface wind was reported as 030 degrees at 11 knots, meaning an almost straight crosswind, and the visibility was marginal, with the RVR just above the minimum for them to start the approach. The aircraft eventually reached the Robbinsville VOR, where they entered the hold, and then continued to get descent clearances whilst they were in there. The pilots were listening in on the radio traffic, and soon one of the aircraft who had landed ahead of them reported that they had experienced poor braking action during the landing roll. This message was relayed via LaGuardia Tower up to the area controller, who transmitted it out onto the frequency, and when the captain heard this, he said, "We can't land with poor." The controller then asked the aircraft ahead of them in the queue, another MD-80 and a CRJ, if they could accept poor braking action for landing, and they both responded negative. But as this was going on, an Airbus A319 was just about to touch down on runway 13. So, as the aircraft in the hold were now getting ready to divert, the controller soon came back and said that another aircraft had just landed and reported braking action as good. Now, these kind of things make decision-making very difficult for pilots. Because pilot reports are, like I mentioned before, subjective in nature, and when you're about to land a 50-ton aircraft at around 300 kilometers per hour, you really don't want a subjective assessment of how well your braking will work. Especially not on an airport like LaGuardia, who has the ice-cold water of Flushing Bay located just beyond the runway end. The controller asked the other aircraft if they were happy to continue, and they all responded that they were, as long as the braking action was still good. The captain meanwhile discussed with his first officer who had reported good braking action, showing that he was well aware of the subjective nature of the report. The first officer responded that it was the Delta flight, and the captain was soon further calmed down when a second aircraft, the CRJ, also landed and reported the same thing. Soon after this, the area controller told the crew to leave the hold and started providing vectors towards final approach. At time 10:58 and 41 seconds, they received the final turn, a clearance to descend to 3,000 feet, and from that altitude they were cleared for the ILS approach runway 13. The crew configured the aircraft according to their procedures, and as soon as they had established themselves on the approach, they were instructed to contact LaGuardia Tower and also informed that the landing RVR was now between 4,000 and 6,000 feet. The first officer read this back, and as he changed the frequency over, there was no update to the braking action. The tower controller welcomed flight 1086 onto the frequency and then cleared them to land. But the captain, who had now noticed that they had a quite significant tailwind of around 11 knots, asked the first officer to check for the latest wind. The tower controller replied that the latest spot wind was 020 degrees at 10 knots, which would mean a slight tailwind component, and when he heard this, the captain just exclaimed, "Oh, jeez." So, why was this exclamation important? Well, the pilots were both well aware of the fact that it was still snowing on the ground, and with that, the conditions could change rapidly. They also knew that their landing performance was calculated on good braking action and that the calculation was already quite marginal, with only a few hundred feet to spare. Any tailwind would increase their ground speed, leading to an even longer landing distance, and their crosswind limitation with a slippery runway was around 10 knots, something that they were now on the edge of. In other words, it is very likely that the captain knew that he was facing several potential threats on this landing and that he therefore would need to perform on his absolute A-game. On the other hand, none of these values were outside any specific limits, so they were perfectly okay to continue the approach. The pilots configured the aircraft for landing and then completed the landing checklist. All of the flight parameters were stabilized as they passed through the landing gate at 1,000 feet and then continued down towards the minima at 214 feet. At time 11:01 and 51 seconds, at an altitude of around 350 feet above ground, the captain called out, "Approach lights in sight," and then 2 seconds later, "We're going to continue." Now, that last call-out was not required according to its SOPs, but what had happened here was that when the aircraft broke through the clouds, the pilots saw something that they had not anticipated. The runway ahead of them was not the black, wet surface they had expected. Instead, the runway was completely white and covered with snow. This would have further heightened the alertness of the captain, and he likely made this call out to reassure his colleague, who was now seeing the same thing. Remember, all of the aircraft ahead of them had been landing without any issues at this point. The speed had now been reduced to their reference speed for flaps 40 plus 5 knots, and at an altitude of around 188 feet, the captain disconnected the autopilot and autothrottle to hand fly the last part. The aircraft passed the runway threshold with a speed of 137 knots, and at time 11:02 and 16 seconds, the main gear touched down about 600 feet in on runway 13, which would have been in the beginning of the touchdown zone. As soon as the weight on wheel switches were activated and a wheel spin-up was sensed, the spoilers should have activated automatically, but likely due to the slippery surface they didn't, so the first officer activated them manually and called out, "Spoilers up!" About 1 second after main gear touchdown, the nose gear was also landed, and at almost the same time, the first officer called out 2 in reverse, referring to the thrust reversers, which the captain had immediately activated upon landing. About 1 second later, the first officer also called out 110 knots. The runway heading was 134 degrees, and the aircraft touched down with a heading slightly to the left of 132 degrees, well within the normal range. And now things started happening very quickly. For the first few seconds, the aircraft tracked the runway centerline reasonably well, but then, because of a combination of different factors, the aircraft started veering to the left. These factors included the effect of the left crosswind, which was now pushing on the aircraft's fin, making it starting to weathercock into the wind. And on top of that, when the captain selected reverse thrust, the left thrust reverser activated slightly quicker than the right, which also pulled the aircraft to the left. The captain obviously noticed this and started to give right rudder to follow the centerline, but in his focus on making sure to get the aircraft to stop, he had made one big mistake. Instead of limiting the reverse thrust to 1.3 EPR, he was now using almost full reverse thrust, with the left engine ultimately giving 2.06 EPR and the right 1.91. And do you remember what happens when that much reverser is being used? Yes, this meant that the effect of the rudder was now completely blanked out by the reversers, and with that, the normal high-speed directional control. And since the runway was slippery, the nose wheel steering was not of much use either because of almost no friction. The first officer who was monitoring this saw how the aircraft started to turn and called out of reverse to get the captain to reduce the reversers and hopefully regain control. But the captain, who was now suddenly dealing with both trying to get the aircraft to stop and regaining directional control, did not seem to hear him. 1.5 seconds later, the first officer again made a call out, louder this time, saying, "Come out of reverse." And at that point, the captain reacted. So 7 seconds after touchdown, the reversers were now reduced back to idle. Now the captain was doing everything he could, including deselecting the auto brake and applying max differential braking, while pushing as much right rudder as he could to get the aircraft back under control. And this actually started to work, but it was sadly too late. 6 seconds after the landing, the aircraft's heading had already veered quite sharply to the left, as much as 20 degrees away from the runway direction. The captain managed to decrease this with about 10 degrees, but the aircraft still departed the runway about 3,200 feet into the landing wall and then continued careening out onto the snow-filled flat area next to it. The left wing soon crashed into the retaining wall, separating the airport from the cold waters of Flushing Bay outside, and as it did so, the fuel tank inside the wing ruptured and fuel started gushing out. The first officer now reached over and turned off both engines to try and stop them from creating any more thrust that could push the aircraft further towards and possibly even into the water. This shut down the electrical power to the cockpit voice recorder, so the last thing recorded was the scraping noise of the left wing tearing against the retaining wall. But the aircraft still kept moving, and finally, at time 11:03, the nose of the aircraft broke through a fence on top of the retaining wall, and the pilots could see how their cockpit went sliding out over the freezing black water below. And then finally, they stopped, with the cockpit and the nose wheel hanging over the edge of the bay and with the rest of the aircraft hinged on the retaining wall just behind the cockpit. But this was still far from the end of this story. In a situation where the aircraft is facing immediate danger, a general rule is that the cabin crew can initiate an evacuation by themselves if nothing is heard from the cockpit and a clearly dangerous situation can be identified. But in this case, the aircraft was still upright, there was no fire or obvious immediate danger that they could see, and they were not in the water, so they held off awaiting commands from the captain. The problem though was that the accident had damaged the aircraft batteries and as a consequence also the intercom and PA system. The first officer tried to start the APU to generate power again, but since the batteries didn't work, this wasn't possible. As this was happening, the tower controller had lost visual contact with the aircraft due to the moderate snowfall and had therefore not seen the accident happening. He tried to contact the aircraft several times, but assumed that they had just switched over to the ground frequency without telling him, so he instead focused on the next landing aircraft, which was a couple of miles out on final. This meant that the accident went by completely unnoticed for the first few minutes, with landing traffic continuing down towards the accident site. But fortunately, one snow-clearing vehicle had seen the aircraft veer off the runway. He radioed what he had seen into his supervisor, who contacted the tower, advising the controller that the runway was now closed, but the full severity of the problem was not clearly communicated. The controller told the approaching aircraft to go around and then asked the clearing team leader to please repeat the reason for the closure of the runway, as he thought it might be due to the snowfall. It wasn't until time 11:06 and 25 seconds, 4.5 minutes after the accident, that the controller fully understood the gravity of the situation and activated the Emergency Alert Notification System, EANS, which got the rescue work going. The captain, meanwhile, had opened the cockpit door and told the purser to assess the emergency exits, but this was made harder by the fact that the purser couldn't communicate with the cabin crew in the back of the aircraft. The captain gave the purser a loudhailer to use for crowd control, since the PA system obviously wasn't working, but this turned out to be quite ineffective, as loudhailers are really only good for short, clear commands and not for information or two-way communication. I have actually tried this myself in a situation where my PA system broke down, and I can absolutely confirm that it's almost impossible to communicate anything constructive using a loudhailer inside of an aircraft cabin. Anyway, the first officer, who had now also realized that they couldn't communicate with the tower, took up his mobile phone and called the company dispatcher, who could then connect him directly to the tower controller. Because of that smart move, he could relay all of the important information about passenger numbers and fuel on board to the rescue workers who were now searching for them. But do you remember that there were 2 lap-held infants traveling with their parents on this flight? Well, these 2 were not on the load sheet since they lacked boarding cards, so when the first officer reported 125 passengers on board, there were actually 127, something that was only noticed hours later. Inside the aircraft, the purser had moved back into the cabin to check on a potentially injured passenger, leaving the 2 front emergency exits unattended, which is a potentially dangerous situation if a quick evacuation would be needed. When she got back though, she told the captain that the 2 front doors were likely unusable since they were hanging over the water, but that the overwing and the aft door seemed okay. At this time, almost 6 minutes after the accident, the firefighters had also finally located the aircraft, and one of them came up under the first officer's window and banged on the body to get the pilot's attention. He told them that the left wing was leaking fuel and asked them to please initiate an evacuation, which the captain now also did. The right overwing exit and the tail cone exit were used for the evacuation, and the whole thing took almost 6 minutes to complete, partially because the passengers were told to leave their things, but to still use their coats and hats since it was cold outside. When all passengers had finally evacuated, 17 minutes had elapsed since the aircraft had come to a stop, and as a reference here, the evacuation requirements for any commercial aircraft is 90 seconds. But of course, the most important thing in this whole story was that no one was seriously injured. The investigation into this accident led to several recommendations, including better training for flight and cabin crew when it came to decision-makings around evacuations, but also how to deal with communication if the internal system would break down. It was also found that more needed to be done, obviously, to give pilots better access to reliable landing data before landing on contaminated runways. And today, we all use something known as a TALPA matrix, which gives conservative assessments of the braking action based on runway state, precipitation and temperatures. And finally, the investigators also called on Boeing and all MD-80 operators to come up with better practices for avoiding higher reverse EPR settings during landings on slippery runways. But on a personal note here, which was also echoed by some of the investigators in a statement, it's just very, very counterintuitive for any pilot to have to limit reverse thrust in a situation when it's actually most needed. Now, you can find all of the recommendations from this accident in a link to my website that you can find here in the video description, and there you can also find links to my sponsor and other super interesting things, so I hope that you check it out. Please also consider leaving a super thanks using the heart-shaped dollar button somewhere here below, or join my wonderful Patreon crew. I would love to see you on my next hangout. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.